Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 624th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Thyrza Nichols Goodeve. We're thrilled to welcome poet andriniki Mattis here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that Black Lives Matter, that here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land that we speak from. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest and host. A pivotal figure in the field of conceptual art, Charles Gaines engages formulas and systems to interrogate the relationships between the objective and subjective realms. He's been the subject of numerous exhibitions in the United States and internationally, and his work is in prominent public collections, including the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Gaines lives and works in Los Angeles. He recently retired from the CalArts School of Art, where he was on the faculty for over 30 years and established a fellowship to provide critical scholarship support for Black students in the M.F.A. art program. And our host today is Thyrza Nichols Goodeve, a writer, editor, artist, and interviewer who writes with rather than on contemporary art and artists. She was formerly senior art editor at the Rail from 2017 to 2019 and is currently an editor at large for the Rail. And with that, it's my pleasure to pass it over to you, Thyrza.
Thank you, Chloe, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail, 624th social environment. So, Charles, I'm thrilled to be here to be speaking with you. And today what we're going to do is really try to focus on the public art project called the American Manifest. But because you have 5 decades of conceptual art behind you that informs this, I thought we should try to do a little bit of a quick entry into it through your work. And so what I wanted to do was start with a work that's often started with, you can go to the next slide, Chloe, because what I'm interested, one of the things that we'll see is that you have trees. Well, yes, okay, so here's the first slide. This is the slide of the 3 parts of the American Manifest. So for people watching, on the left is Times Square, which is up right now. These they're up through September, I believe. The second is a rendering of what we will talk about later, which is the Governor's Island. It's called Moving Chains. It will be a work that will go up in October with public programming. And the third is in 2023, which will be American Manifest in Cincinnati. It's crazy to think of how Cincinnati is in the news as of yesterday with the guy trying to assassinate or whatever, the FBI. So these are all parts of this. We go into the next, situate American Manifest within the context of your early work. And we can talk about what I want people to understand is the kind of conceptual artist you are, because you are obviously a very unique one. You have your own formulations of that. So if we go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So this is your famous work called Walnut Tree Orchard from 1975. And I guess the question is, tell me why this is and is not about a tree and what that means.
Well, just first I want to say I'm happy to be here and I appreciate the invitation.
Good.
And so I guess Walnut Tree Orchard is a good example to start with, because I mean, just before I started the series, I began a series called Regression, and that was the first work that where I used systems, that employed systems to address an issue that was important to me, and that is a kind of suspicion about the position or the role of subjectivity has played in the defining of that essentially the general idea that art is a subjective practice, which at the time excluded intellectual practices from the process, and also a certain suspicion about the modernist construct of subjectivity and how that's featured so prominently in European history, but essentially didn't exist anywhere else in the world. And with that in mind, that art existed universally, and this represented the European practice that an idea of art production that didn't that was not embraced by the rest of the world because there was no notion of subjectivity in the rest of the world. I mean, the idea of subjectivity is a great construct and great invention. I'm not saying that, but what happened was that I found that when I was making work, if I approached a blank canvas and tried to intuit an idea, I was successful in what I thought in forming a concept that made a mark on a work of art, but it didn't mean anything to me. I had no passion, and it certainly wasn't a material marking of my subjectivity. And so I was looking for other ways of making art, or retiring early and becoming a lawyer. So, but then I ran into some material that led me to, and I expanded my reach globally, and I ran into some material about other ways of practice and production outside of the intuitive imagination. And I found out that that has interested me, but I found out that if I were to try to engage that as a Westerner, the closest thing that I could come to was systems and numbers, and let a system make the decisions, and that otherwise would be left to one's intuition. I recognized early that I wasn't trying to eliminate intuition as out of the practice of art. I was trying to place it in the practice in a way that was meaningful to me. So regression theory started it. Yeah, regression theory started, and that segued into the walnut tree orchard. That's why it's not about trees. It's about the application of systems in order to produce works.
Exactly. Like you have a great quote where you, as part of you say, as part of my criticism of modernism, I try to expand on the idea of how what we call the aesthetic experience is cultural. Or this whole idea of this subjective, the unconscious, art as a product systems, and that even the most affective system, the one that's most emotional, say music, which is what we'll get to later, is also rooted in a system. And for you, these systems are culturally, well, for all of us, they are culturally imposed. So just briefly for the next slide, just to put you into the context, obviously you come out of conceptual art. You talk about Hannah Darbovin is important to you, but I just thought I'd put the Kossuth up, because here's a perfect example of early conceptual art that's about issues of representation, right? The chair is a photograph, the chair is an actual physical object, the chair as a description. So, but what I'd like you to do is talk about how your own situated experience, and particularly how you grew up, shifts the meaning and reasons for why representation became so loaded for you.
I'm glad that you put Kossuth up. I mean, the way I differentiate myself from the prior generation of conceptual artists is that they weren't interested in representation, and I continue to be one. Darbovin was the psychological relationship that existed between the patterns and structures that she marked over time and her own psychological state. So there was room to think about that in looking at those endless patterns of repetition. And whereas Kossuth, I think, was involved in interrogation of empirical practices that was, popular with conceptual artists, but he was trying to deal with it on the level of language, to sort of regard language as an empirical property, not so much. I mean, it looks like he's in questioning representation by creating this sublime construct where we don't know where reality is, between objects and words. But in fact, he's trying to empiricize the representational object, and I wasn't interested, or the representation itself, or let's say that you're trying to locate the fact that it's hard to find the real, the source of what is real, and that because everything is then redefined, come to us in the form of representation. And this is a certain kind of empirical linguisticism that I think he was involved in.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me doing research on you is that I come from the generation in the 80s where we talked a lot about semiotics and structuralism and representation. And so that's why I was interested in the idea of that, the arbitrariness, say, of the linguistic sign for you, and you looking at that and thinking of the way even the visual sign, or say the photograph itself, comes from a system, right? And that's the system you were building in the tree. Can you then talk about the way, if we could have the next slide, this is you talk about when you started to connect the interest in critique of subjectivity and systems with how you were brought up in Jim Crow South. And I kept thinking about, these are literal signs, obviously, of difference. If you could talk about that.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, that in the early 70s, I got involved in systems and the grid because of my interest in the issue of representation and subjectivity. And so I was asked at the time, since I was involved in that, and I was asked at the time by friends who were involved in the Black arts movement and so forth. They asked me why I was doing white art, because they associated what I was doing with conceptual artists, and conceptual artists were all white. And one of the problems of that was that it didn't deal with the issue, the cultural issues of art representation. And so I didn't know how to answer the question. I thought it was a good question, and I thought I needed to figure out the answer. I wasn't happy with the idea of saying that art is universal, and don't call me a Black artist, just call me an artist, because I didn't believe that. I believed that I was heavily informed by my cultural experience, and so ultimately I came to the conclusion that my interest in subjectivity and systems and structures and language came out of my experience in growing up in Charleston in the Jim Crow South. And I left Charleston when I was 5 years old and went back to repeatedly back to Charleston every summer to get us kids out of their hair. And so I continued to experience Jim Crow the discrimination. Well, it was really interesting that I just experienced two forms of discrimination: one, Jim Crow discrimination, and Newark, New Jersey system of discrimination, and they operated quite differently. The result was always the same, but I thought that what it sort of questioned when I was very young is, why are these categories of rules constructed around these categories that seem to put me on the bottom end of it, and so you put this sign up. A represents an early discovery of how social and cultural patterns come out of a structure, and signs are reflective of that structure. and rather than things necessarily things of themselves. I mean, it might be interesting to compare it with Kossuth because, you know, although the idea of reality of the chair beyond language became a question, it was still it didn't deal with the issue of what is language as a cultural product. How does that inform the whole idea where we are raising questions about the reality of the chair? Exactly. And for me, the object then, especially the object that signified the Jim Crow era, really was a perfect example of how things that are thought to be real and natural actually come from. And the signs that are produced around that are a product of that ideology that presupposes and pre-exists the emotional, psychological concepts and ideas of the people who play out that ideology.
That's excellent. So then if we go to, again, to the walnut tree slide next again, now setting up that as the context for how that this is exactly not about a tree at all, not about it's the photograph, it's you created the system. So this was 1975, and I want to move a little bit more quickly to the next slide, and how you have continued to make work with various, I mean, as much as these aren't about trees, and we'll get to this when we talk about Times Square, there is something to the effect of the specific trees you've chosen over time and the location and the site specificity of those as well. But I didn't, if you would like to just start to talk about how you added color. We have a series of them, and I'm also curious about sort of titles and what the titles do with these. So this is 1970.
Start with the fact that my imperative to employ systems comes out of a general critique of modernism, which itself was a product of the Enlightenment, and which itself had advanced this idea of the universal construct, something that is not culturally produced. And so I had suspicions with that idea. I traced it all the way back to the way representation was dealt with in works of art. I wanted to show that, in fact, it was ideologically determined that this, and the Enlightenment was producing a falsehood that there are such things as the universal construct, when I think in actuality, you know, so the constructs, those things that form social and cultural patterns are not natural, but socially and culturally constructed. And going back to art, to make this point, I thought that, well, the kinds of decisions that we make in art, particularly around aesthetics and universal aesthetics, we think are a product of our intuition, which is a universal construct. And I wanted to show that, in fact, those kind of decisions are made by an ideology and not by, you know, a subjectivity. Our notion of subjectivity becomes the vehicle through which our ideology plays. And so I wanted to demonstrate that by just suggesting that I can make a system that makes decisions in the production of work of art, and your relationship with that art object is still poetic, or with whatever terms that you have in making a work of art, that it didn't turn into this machine production that was you know, that was limited. The system is essentially photographing a series of trees and turning those photographs into digital, what they call the digital image. In those days, I called it a kind of geometry, a numerically based geometry, converting them into a grid image, and then overlaying the different trees on top of each other in the series, and assigning a different color to each tree that is part of that overlay system. And we start with one tree and could wind up with 10, 12, 16 trees. And in this piece, you can see that there are 10 trees overlaid here. And so you get all of these aesthetic effects that you can enjoy, I guess. I don't know. I mean, you can address them according to the same sort of formal terms that you address any work of art, but nothing on there was produced by my imagination.
And when
Yes.
you show these, do you show series of 10, you show all 10 so people see the iteration, because that's as important as the singular image, or
Yeah,
no?
when I have exhibitions that I show the whole series, but it's not important that you see the whole series.
Okay.
That because in any individual piece you have the structure that produces the series.
Right.
You have that available to you, even without knowing what the rest. For example, you saw number 5 in a series of 10. You would know that you were brought to the number 5, but you can see the evidence of that. But then you would also know there's continued. Even before you see evidence of the continuation, you understand that's the idea of the role of the system in this production. The ideal situation is to show them all, but it's not necessary.
Okay, can we see the next slide, which is just another quote, Chloe? This is sort of what you've been saying. I just wanted to have it there for people. Your single issue being the relation between the creative imagination and the mark that constitutes the body of the work of art. And rather than say that the mark was made by the creative imagination, I could say this mark was made by a system. So I took that from an interview you did. This is basically what you've been saying, but I wanted to just emphasize that. And then shift then to the next series you started, which is, did these start in the late 70s where you started to do people's faces?
Yes, the Faces series started in the late 70s. The Walnut Trees started around 73, and then Faces around 78. Oh, there it is, 1978. Yes, I'm correct. and this is, it's interesting to bring this up because this is an early manifestation of something, a transition that I had to face in my practice in later years, and that is that by using the face, I inadvertently used an explosive cultural form or cultural image, that which is different from the tree. We can accept the mathematics of the deciduous branchwork, the deciduous tree or the branchwork as a certain geometry. But with face, it's much more complicated because you can't help but say, who is that? Nobody ever asked me, who that tree is that I photographed. But everybody always asked me, who's that guy or who's that woman? And what is she doing there? And so they want to know stuff about her. And so for a long time, I ignored that aspect of it because what was happening on is that there were these social and cultural critiques that were entering the work about the subject itself, rather than this sort of interrogation, a more philosophical interrogation of the art as a formal practice and its relationship to the world. It was getting more in detail about that. So that actually is something that helped evolve what I call the second part of my practice, which is the language series.
Just out of curiosity, what was the first face you chose, or is that not important?
Oh, I don't remember. I'd have to look at the series to see what it was. But
that's interesting.
Yeah, I just asked. I was teaching in Fresno, California, and I just asked people, students, and friends if they would pose for the series, and then I just photographed them.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay, the next one moves towards, again, using color. The next slide. So this would be, I guess, also an iterated one. It says face 7. So there would have been 6 before this.
Yes, the series is played out is exactly like the trees. That is using the same system of converting the face into a digital. And that the word digital didn't have the meaning in 1970.
Well, that's exactly, I think, is you've had to learn how to accept that, haven't you? Because I think at first there was a resistance where people probably thought you were making a commentary on digital art when you weren't, right?
Yeah, well, it's still resisted because there's always this ideas about social engineering around the use of digitalization, and that that I think it has absolutely nothing to do with what I'm dealing with. Like, for example, the idea that that our phones can recognize our faces now is a segue into mind control or something like that, and that I'm a participant in advancing that sort of atrocious behavior. And so somehow I just don't like that reference.
Well, it's
so I still resist it. But that's what I said, that goes into the complexity of using faces, which is different from using trees as the subject. But otherwise it's formed in precisely the same way. But this series also represents that transition that I was talking about. I was asked in a panel, not in a panel, but a speech that I was going to talk, why am I approaching, why do I approach, particularly as I was developing the language works, and why was I occluding the specific cultural concept behind this gaze of philosophical and linguistic and discursive patterns, and why don't I deal directly with the politics of the subject that I was dealing with? And I hemmed and hawed and couldn't figure out a good answer to that either. But and so finally I just said, well, I'm just going to face it. I'm going to embrace the political subject, or the politics of the subject I'm dealing with, because essentially I always felt that I was dealing with a political concept.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I thought that, well, I'll just embrace that. So in this series, which is called Multiracial, Multi-Ethnic, I asked people who self-identified as multiracial or multi-ethnic to let me take photographs of them and ask them to identify their identity as part of that. And then I did the layered series based upon that, where I thought in terms of a certain kind of poetic analysis of the system of layering, which I always regarded as producing something, but what's being produced was really arbitrary. It is in itself not intended to mean anything specific, but becomes available to use. But I thought that sense of arbitrariness could be an analogy to some of the misconceptions we have about race in society, and how it is being misused, particularly by the political right, that in trying to create categories of difference that are highly racist and prejudicial. Right. Not being able to embrace the actual fact that race and identity are all social constructs rather than natural forms. The conservatives, the people who are still invested in white supremacy and superiority, need to feel that race and identity are natural constructs to solidify their superiority and protect it against any kind of criticism that would dismantle that hierarchy. And so I was wanting to do something to suggest that structure that they're proposing was false, and that it's actually these concepts are constructions and they're mutable.
Well, this will bring us, this is where, when we talk about the Harriet and David Scott case, the Dred Scott case of 1857, in terms of the American Manifest, how important that is. And I want to make that transition to the manifesto's works that you started in 2008 to 2020. But I wanted to set it up as, I think you have your sort of acoustic conceptualism. And I think it's really interesting the way that your interest in showing that even the most affect, and it could be a pattern from music or jazz, for you became interested, as it says here, you would listen to jazz and you were listening for patterns and inventions, not necessarily the melodies and the songs. And that goes into, now if you could describe the manifesto, an archive of over 100 different political manifestos and texts and so on and so forth. And you put them to music. So why don't you try to describe to everyone what you do with those?
Yes, manifestos, that series is part of the practice I call the language-based pieces. And in manifestos, what I do is I do manifestos going back to the 16th century. And to do a piece, I select a certain number of those essays, those manifestos. And I take them through a process where I convert the letters of the manifesto to musical notation. The system of musical notation is not something I invented. It had been used in the Baroque period, where Baroque composers actually thought there was a mystical relationship between text because of content and music, sound, the abstraction of text and sound. But I did it based upon the same sort of interest that I had with the grid work, and that is to produce something not based upon my imagination, but based upon a system, and have the results have the appearance of coming from my imagination. And that appearance would set up a critique of what, representation, how our representation actually works. The system is simple. The letters A through G are translated into the notes A through G, and also use H. I translate H's to B flat, which is an old tradition. And I come up with what I call a raw translation, usually written in the form of a piano score with voice, where the letters of the notes form the melody, and and it's accompanied by chords, where the first note in a word would become the chord that accompanies the note. And and then I take that raw translation and arrange it for an ensemble. What you see here is in the installation version is the raw translations on the right, and on the left you see a scrolling text of the manifesto that I selected.
And this manifesto 4 is which writing? Is it?
Yeah, this is the Dred Scott decision.
It is the same. Okay.
Yes, and what it is the text from the decision. It's the majority opinion by Tanny, and the dissent by Curtis. And there's a fifth part to that where that I just added, which is the Frederick Douglass's response to the Dred Scott decision.
And what was
you don't see here.
For people who may not know, what was the Dred Scott decision, 1857? Story behind that.
Well, of course, Dred and Harriet Scott were slaves, and they were at a certain point they moved to it from a slave. It's just a little complicated, but the territory. But at the time, before the Civil War, America was involved in this expansion, of course, toward the West. And so there were states and there were territories, and territories, later became states, but the territories were allowed to develop their own laws for the most part, except in cases where the federal government circumscribed their ability to construct those laws. And one of the things that they were allowed to do is territories were allowed to be free territories, which bothered the South.
Right.
So Dred and Harriet were slaves in a slave state, in a slave territory, and we were moved to a free territory, and then moved back. And when they were moved back to the slave territory, which was they applied for or sued for their freedom based upon the idea that was a convention at the time that when a slave is moved to a free territory, they've gained their freedom forever. And even if they go back to a slave territory, they can't sue for their freedom. And so the question was whether Dred and Harriet were allowed to sue for their freedom, being in a return to a slave territory. And so there are three trials. One, they were given, said yes, they could sue for their freedom, and which was a common practice in the St. Louis area at the time anyway, because several hundred slaves had sued for their freedom that were moved into a free territory and were given their freedom. But for some reason, the owners of Dred and Harriet, they wanted to fight this. So when they lost in the first round, they appealed and won in the second round. So Dred and Harriet were told that they did not have the right to sue for their freedom. And so then abolitionists got behind it and sued and appealed to the Supreme Court in St. Louis. And this is where the decision came down, which is probably the most atrocious decisions in the history of jurisprudence, not only in the United States, but worldwide, where it was decided that they could not, essentially they could not sue for their freedom because the United States was created as a white nation. And since Dred and Harriet weren't white, they couldn't be citizens. And you need to be a citizen to be free.
Yeah, just horrific. And so let's keep moving, because you also use this in the beautiful piece that you did, Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And Chloe, if you can get ready to show a short clip that we have of Charles talking about that, where again the Dred Scott case is used as the backdrop, and you talk about it. And this way we can also see the notation of the words and the music as well.
This is the decision that ultimately legalized racial discrimination and concretized the idea that Black people were less than human. Its significance is that we've never actually escaped that ruling. The Skybox 2 are the legal filings that were put into place in the course of the second trial. When you enter the gallery, you see the wall of documents, and presumably, you start reading it. At a certain point, you would notice that the lights are fading, and you would notice that those specks of light that accurately followed the pattern of the night sky. And as it goes darker, you begin to identify that these are stars. There is absolutely no relationship of the night sky to the Dred Scott files. Cognitively, you make a relationship that cognitive process produces sentiment. I mean, once you make that connection, then you can think of reasons why, which people do. I mean, the letters convert to dots, so you can look at this night sky as a kind of language, or that the question itself is about race and identity, is a transcendent construction that is larger than our ability. These different reasons, but what they have in common is that everybody is put into the same cognitive space, and what they do with it, that depends on their experience, not mine. I'm not using this to liberate the world, so there's not a cause and effect thing. My thoughts are more abstract than that. If we engage in construction of meaning in the way that I try to emphasize, cultural discourse will shift and change in ways that I don't know, but maybe I would be a participant in the shifting of cultural discourse as a consequence of dealing with these subjects.
So yes, that piece is just absolutely spectacular. I've only seen it through this video, So it was at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Will it be coming to New York just on a personal? Is it going to be coming here at all?
No,
Oh, well.
no. An earlier Skybox One was shown at the
At MoMA?
at a gallery show here in New York, Paula Cooper's several years ago. But this piece, no, we're hoping to make it part of my retrospective survey in Miami.
Ah, when is that?
December 2023.
Okay, all right, that's exciting. That's to look forward to. Anyway, again, we're rushing through, but trying to get all of the layers of your work. So now here we are at the three-part American Manifest. So first question is, this is your first public artwork, right? Is this true?
Yes, I mean, I did a smaller, public piece commission in Sacramento in the early 70s, but excuse me, the early 80s, but that was it.
Okay, so here, let's go to the shots of yeah, okay, so this is Times Square right now, where these trees are. So now talk to us about these trees. Who are they? What are they doing? Why?
Yeah, well, I was asked to do this piece with this larger commission, American Manifest, which is a long story we won't get into here. But as part of that, I was asked to come up with a piece for Times Square that, of course, would be part of the larger narrative of American Manifest. And so what I thought to do was to find out what vegetation existed in Times Square before New York City was created, and found that one common plant was the sweet gum tree. And so we found some in Kentucky and pulled out of the ground now, just so that people will know that I'm not contributing to global warming. These trees were being pulled out anyway. Okay. And I simply asked them if they could be very careful in excavating these trees so they wouldn't destroy the root system. And we selected 8 of them and brought them up to a fabricator. Had them dried out for 3 or 4 weeks in a kiln, and as a way of preserving them. And then we painted them. The color we chose was the average color of the variety of shades of gray that existed in the actual tree. We averaged that out to this color that you see here. And we planted them upside down, root side up, as a clear poetic expression of the idea of their absence in Times Square and what was the reason for their absence. And we could talk about that in terms of the origin of American capitalism and the origin of American colonialism, and the practice of removal of land, of course, the taking the land away from the native population, but the act of removing populations from their native site, like the movement of slaves, Black Africans to the United States, and the selling of slaves, which happened right here in Manhattan down on Water Street. And so the reversal is intended to bring up those parts of history and illuminate them, because we know that those slavery is part of American history, but it's not been presented as the incredibly gruesome practice that it was, and the violence that the whole metaphor of movement and excavation and negation suggests in terms of how that's applied to people and populations. That aspect of the history of the subject, I was hoping that the piece would engage.
Yeah, you said you brought up 8. I believe there are 7. Is it 7 that are in Times Square, or is it 8?
There's 7. I brought up 8, just in case something went wrong. We were intended to have 7, and just bought up an extra one just in case we need.
Okay, because it's the 7. I don't know if this is just a coincidence, but when I was reading about the history of the Dred Scott case, there were 7 justices. Is that why there's 7? Or am
Oh, that's the fact that I did not know.
Okay.
But I will take possession of that right now.
Okay,
Yes,
okay, there you go.
absolutely.
Yeah, I found it okay. Just trying to use my nerdy side.
I love that.
Yeah. Well, it when I was there, I kept thinking, well, why 7? 7 is a mystical number. 7 is, there's all sorts of reasons, and sometimes there isn't. Now, it's quite something to see in the context of Times Square for anybody who goes and visits it, because Times Square is so gargantuan, and these are so, it's kind of a, how to describe it? It's a very moody, tender, melancholic, beautiful, ghost, there's all sorts of things one could say about these trees, but they're also kind of consumed and overwhelmed by American capitalism in a way that's quite, that is upsetting. And I just wondered if you could have put them anywhere in New York, where would you have chosen another place other than Times Square?
Well, that's it's an interesting question. I'd never even thought about that. It grew out of the site.
Because it grew out of the
piece
site, yeah.
grew right out of the site. And one of the things we didn't know is how it would interact with the site. The contradiction perfectly is built into the idea.
Exactly, right.
And hopefully the contradiction would actually intensify the metaphor that I was trying to create, that act as a critique of slavery capitalism.
Yeah, definitely.
But I have to admit, after it was up, I felt that it functioned well in the space.
Yeah,
I did. I felt that it was so ironic and so different.
Yeah,
that it managed to survive being dwarfed by the massiveness of the environment.
yeah. And everything else is sort of so cheery and so gung-ho, bye-bye, spectacle, color, light, and everything. And then there's just this sort of like moment where you just stop, and they sort of bring silence with them. Just now to move, because we only have about 10 more minutes. So the wider context of American ways that connect New York, and then the third part is in Cincinnati, Ohio. St. Louis was where the Dred Scott case was. And so I wanted to just sort of show a picture of sort of that era, that moment when, and the waterways, but talk about the way the rivers and the waterways function in American Manifest. There's a paradoxical meaning to them.
The project itself we've broken up into 3 chapters. So Times Square and Governor's Island is we're calling chapter 1, and chapter 2 is I'm sorry. Times Square is chapter 1. Governor's Island is chapter 2, and in Governor's Island, a piece that we haven't mentioned yet, which is Moving Chains, will be revealed, and then chapter 3 is the third reveal of these objects in Cincinnati. When I was coming up with the idea, the commission to do the work, it started in St. Louis, and so the Dred Scott case, because St. Louis, of course, is where the trials took place. The courthouse sits near the banks of the Mississippi River. And of course, also there is the Saarinen Arch. And so right there was this incredible paradoxes where notions of a manifest destiny and the American Constitution of liberty managed for years and years and years to override what was at the core of them, and this sort of very shameful history of occupation and removal. And you're aware of that contradiction in St. Louis if you know the history. If you don't, you're just overwhelmed by America's greatness and key to that idea, of course, is American capitalism. And the waterways are very important because the United States was an agrarian culture that traded in commodities of one sort or another and built its wealth based upon that, and the river is central to that. So when I was trying to come up with an idea, I wanted to build a narrative around these sites. So it's a site-specific work where rivers are very important. It's tools and mechanisms of commodity transaction, which builds the economy. New York City is particularly important because the rivers around there are also used for that reason. But in addition, we have the building up of American capitalism, the banks and the systems of trade, centralized in New York, and that became the center of the United States for that. So New York was not only a place where slaves were traded, but also where that slave capitalism was created, and whereas these institutions of wealth are built around that. That speaks to the site specificity of the work, and making these 3 chapters. It simply was a kind of developmental narrative of the movement of those ideologies.
So Chloe, if we could jump to slide 34, and we can go back to the performance that was at Times Square at the end, but I prefer to go to right now too, because and Charles, you and I will have if you're available, have time to be going more in depth into Governor's Island and Cincinnati, and what I hope is a follow-up to this interview that we publish in print. But this is the rendering of what looks to be quite a powerful piece that you're planning to do at Governor's Island called Moving Chains in October. And it's on the Waterways. So why don't you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, Moving Chains is the what we call the second chapter in this narrative. And it's a structure that's 100 feet long and about 17 feet high, maybe a little taller than that. And at the base, it's 15 feet wide. At the top of it, as you can see, there are 8 links of chains. Each chain link is about 14 to 16 inches long and about 7 feet wide. And it's made of aluminum. So these links are connected together to make these strands that each strand is 100 feet long. Well, it's actually 200 because each strand would wrap around the gear system and return to its origin in a loop. And so each strand, there are 8 of them, and each is about 200 feet long. And the structure allows itself to be seen from the outside, because at the side you can get above it, where if you look at the length of chains, they metaphorize the river. And this is because the chains move. That's why we call it moving chains. It's brilliant. But in any case, the speed of the river, which is about 2 knots, 1.52 knots. And the center chain is supposed to move at the speed of the vessels that went up the river for trade in the middle of the 1800s. And that they moved at about 4 to 5 knots. So the chains are moving, the center chain moving faster than the other chains. And as you see it from the top, the natural slope of the chains as they go over what was called the idlers. It sort of looked like waves, but when you went inside, the river metaphor turns into a kind of slave ship metaphor where you were there underneath the chains, and we are imagining the experience of being underneath this massive tonnage of metal, and the sound that it produces as it's moving across the gears would be pretty intimidating.
It sounds just incredible. It sounds extraordinary. Yeah, it sounds. And you're also going to be having public programmings that you don't know about yet, but just for people to know, this is be going up in October. So keep your eyes out for it. It's opening, and then all of the public programming around it. Wow. All right. So we're heading towards the end. So why don't we and then I guess Chloe, just show the last shot briefly of this is okay, so this is the chapter 3, Cincinnati, and again just so people know that will be happening at some point in 2020. Back to the earlier slides that show that there is actually a performance in Times Square in July of Manifesto 4. And so this way people can see how you were doing your sonic conceptualism along with all of your other kind of complicated conceptual work. So here's an image of Manifesto 4. This is the orchestra, and then the background is the text from the Dred Scott decision, right?
That's right.
Right. Okay. So there's that shot. Then there's next slide. Another one to give you a sense of the context of it all in Central Park. Here is one of the singers. And then the next shot is of the orchestra. And we're lucky enough to have some excerpts. We'll sort of end this discussion and segue into the Q&A with the 2 clips took place in July. And so just to reiterate, right, everything we're hearing, even if it's melodic and it sounds as though it's orchestrated, it's based on this system of annotation of A to a note, B to a note, and so on and so forth, right?
That's right.
That, which is amazing, because it sounds really melodic and quite moving. How long was the performance?
It's about an hour and 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, so much, and I know that there's going to be a lot of questions and answers. So, but before we go into that, I did just want to give you a chance also, because I think it could be part of the discussion as we talked about to, you know, you taught at CalArts for 30 years. You recently retired. Congratulations. You are a legendary teacher of many people and many artists. but I'd like you to talk about the scholarship that's been set up at CalArts because for Black and Latino students, because I think it's a great role model. And I'm shouting out to my school, the School of Visual Arts and all the other schools, that if this kind of thing could be started. So if you would just talk about that a bit before we move to Q&A.
Sure. I mean, in the 30 years I've been teaching at CalArts, and even where I taught before, you know, the representation of students of college, particularly Black students, was pretty dismal, and particularly in M.F.A. programs.
Yeah.
And so one of the problems that we had was that it was very difficult. The money issue was a more acute problem with students of color than it was with the general population, even though money is a problem with everybody. So there's not to say that, but there was not much access for students of color relative to money, relative to what we consider the wealth. The wealth distribution, that Black families have 10% of the wealth of white families nationally. That plays out differently in the individual families, but that's the generality. And I thought that there should be a scholarship program for that, but I had no luck for 29 years convincing the school of that. In fact, at a certain point, they said that they couldn't do it because it was illegal.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and but everybody was sensitive to the problem. It said, yeah, it's a terrible travesty. Yeah, we really feel sorry for it. We wish we can do something about it. And so at a certain point, I said, well, maybe I can start it myself and create a situation that could expand into a regular scholarship program. So what I did is I donated the money to run the scholarship, to bring 2 students to CalArts for 3 years. But I said I would do this. I would do this if the school agreed to develop a program to make this a permanent scholarship, and by building an endowment. And we had a president that was very sensitive to that idea and agreed to do that. And so the program's been running for a couple of years now, and they've been fairly successful at getting close to the endowment to make it permanent.
That's great. That's great. Well, congratulations on that. Well, thank you much. I now want to open it up. Chloe, send it back to you and open it up to questions. I'm sure they're in comments.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Charles and Thyrza, for that amazing conversation. We do have a few questions, and so I'll start with a question from our friend GE. GE, you're gonna get a notification to unmute here.
Thank you, Chloe, Thyrza, and Charles. I was thinking a lot about what you were saying earlier about jazz and everything, and I was even thinking in the back of my mind about Oscar Pettiford and the way he would compose and things. And I was thinking, is there indeed no such thing as kind of a phenomenology in making art, but there are phenomenological problems to be?
Well, when you say, can you be more specific when you use the word phenomenology in terms of art making?
Yeah, systems of approach, systems of gathering, systems of making, and I'm thinking parallel in terms of jazz composition or composition. Specific approaches that would be made to composition, and the kind of choices that are made versus choices, and maybe the choices that are not made consciously.
Yeah, you understand. So the issue is what goes on to produce the experience of listening. Yeah, and From my from my point of view, in jazz, of course, we have to think about improvisation as that source of the experience and how improvisation is experienced. And that goes to what I was saying earlier about, or what was said about my interest in patterns, because in jazz, there's a structure where the melodies, oftentimes the traditional melody is framed for the purpose of improvisation, and there are very specific rules with regard to improvisation, unless you're talking about free jazz, and the experience of choice and expression is identified and survive the rules that frame that experience. In other words, it doesn't seem like musical theory limits you from expression, that it actually opens you up to the idea of expression. And then I take that directly to my own interest, that our ability to recognize patterns is a consequence of this negotiated space between absolute freedom and rules. And so in that respect, I found that I was very interested in the sense and the experience of the recognition of pattern in jazz. And I was trained as a jazz drummer, so it also sort of explained why drums is very interested. I was very interested in drumming as a kid because of the percussive patterns that are produced. And in terms of producing these visual practice, and I do feel that there's a relationship between the experience of looking at these trees and faces and so forth, and listening, to Thelonious Monk.
I hear you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Charles. Our next question comes from Duncan Bellamy. Duncan, I am going to ask you to unmute now.
Hey, Charles. Love your work and thanks for a great talk. I think actually the previous question kind of covers this to some extent, which was, I'm a drummer as well, and I also have I also happen to have a kind of think more in terms of patterns, systems, as opposed to in a kind of melodic structure much of the time. And I think you kind of explained it, but I wanted just to your experience as a drummer has informed your experience as a visual artist, and would you say that has some kind of direct correlation to your interest in patterns and systems?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, for a long time, I didn't know how the two are related by the fact that, my history as a musician and my interest in music in general, just, listening to music. Because people, look at my early work and it's so rule oriented, and then when I look at my interest in music, I find that, anything from, Mahler and Bruckner and classical music to Coltrane and Sonny Rollins, explosive, very explosive. I was called a heavy-footed drummer because I was loud. And I couldn't figure out, how come I have this sort of intellectualism in my art and this emotionalism in my music, and how do they work together? But just in fact, just recently, within the last 5 years, I've come to a conclusion about that is it's actually through the recognition of pattern and repetition that connects my interest between these two practices. And I really feel that I was just talking about, I don't believe in these core ideas of subjectivity, and so, having said that, I think somehow that interest in patterns is buried in my soul. Don't tell anybody I said that.
I'm glad I could draw it out of you. Drummers Union, huh? Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much. And the last question is from myself, Charles. I was wondering if you could speak to the process of making a series of public artworks for public audiences in sites that and structures and audiences, Times Square being an enormous international audience and people coming from all over the world, and then Governor's Island being a very specific site and audience in New York, and then Cincinnati being so close to St. Louis, and being in the Midwest, and how you and the studio are thinking about those three unique sites for the work.
This experience that I'm going through now with this project is unique to me, and it's for me almost overwhelming. It's just been the most amazing thing, and it's just getting started. But principally because it's having me, it's taking me through things that I've never been through in the production of art all these years. I mean, like studio art is a solitary practice for the most part, and when you are and then even if you're a musician, the proscenium separates you from the audience, even though it's more of a social experience than being a visual artist. It's different from audience producer relationship that I found like in tennis or baseball or football, which in those cases, the A player is in relationship to throngs of people. But the point is that there is this real and palpable relationship between audience and player in sports that just doesn't exist in art, except when you have these opportunities to make public sculpture. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to start tearing up here. I've never had that experience before. Hmm. I can't believe it. I didn't expect that to happen. So I never had that experience before, and it's just remarkable. I'm glad to have had the opportunity to have it.
It's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I can't thank either of you enough for this incredible conversation today, and for your generosity in sharing all of your ideas with us, Charles. It's an amazing conversation. At the Rail, and before I transition to poetry, Thyrza, do you have any closing thoughts or remarks?
No, just I'm so thankful for Charles, your work, and also this trajectory, and then to see that at this moment you moving into such a deep and different space and using all that you've worked with. I feel I think that we're all very privileged to be experiencing this with you, and I can't wait to see the Governor's Island and further on. So thank you so much for your, you retired, but hardly, right? You retired from teaching, but now you're starting a whole new thing. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, andriniki mattis, to the stage. Poet andriniki mattis has received fellowships from Cave Canem, Poets House, and the Poetry Project. They earned an M.A. in creative writing and education from Goldsmiths University of London and a B.A. in political and poetic resistance from Brooklyn College. Their work has appeared in Nepantla, Cortland Review, Wasafiri, the anthology The Sun Isn't Out Long Enough, and elsewhere. Andriniki is from and currently living in Brooklyn. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. So great to see your work, Charles. Really profound impact you've had. Yeah, I'll get into a few poems. I'll read first, I think, something that's more in conversation with Charles' work, and it's called Call Me Mischief. Call me mischief for not feeling more than a tremor, an earthquake or two, shutting my eyelids to hallmarks of genocide a museum can't hide. Every road map of language, every block of land central to existence. The plane hitting the tarmac, peace finding its holster, the ash of everything before time and after it. Now beginning again in plants and trees, hungry for earth. I am most Black when making solve of poison. There has always been haven and hell in trees. Central Park was a village of Black people once. Pressing the escape key from purgatory or an end to wage labor. Now it sits near buildings full of promises never fulfilled. That sit still through unrest, a protest, a banned book, a word, a people, silence, queer, fag, tranny dyke, an island for each struggle, warfare, welfare, warfare, bombs, shrapnel, a Black American erased on a trip to the supermarket, call it government, call it Memorial Day, soldiering through America, freedom, picket fence white is assimilation, oppressed by the air, the stench of waste, a Black ballot, a woman's choice, if only simply a choice, if only just for women. The body pried apart as if merely an animal, a mouth breather, breeder, a person lost to the winds of water, to the limbo of the boat ride, a middle passage, time endlessly peeling back the echo, history repeating itself, named fate, to be made a prisoner of water, storied like plantations, Black and unbothered, a strawberry sky, measuring my likeness to stars, a Venn diagram with queer at every root, every tendril tree, a branch, a window, a revolution, a departure, a distant Black life, a boy with garlands circling the universe of his mind, a body in love with living, golden where every vine meets thorn to bear a rose. Mr. Lonely, captain of the weirdos, chanting for glitter and insurance and vaccines and rage, epidemics to pandemics, a cure, N95s, tossing coins and hope into the fountain's mouth, sky mirroring ocean, waves answering the shore like its first name, a cotton candy skyline where road does not exist, mimicking the cool blues of night and riotous as the Black sky, as infectious as joy. A ballroom, a balloon released into the sky. Too much heartbreak. We rise each day like sunsets in an abandoned city, the rosé pink sky bubbling with a bitter beauty, a painfully yellow summer's day. On blood-stained concrete, America's murder, the violence, the final address on land, sinking ships, tempered water, strong enough to put out every forest fire, every word made of flowers becoming a gun. Too much fight to be a bullet, to end a world, dirty as a constitution, so touched like a smile, so Black like a heart. So I'll just read. The capitalism wants to know what's in my pants so it can pay me accordingly. Oh, sweet good night to the woman put upon me. I put to sleep right here in the living room of my mind, the coffee table deceptively littered with the residue of my gender subdued. I make drag of dresses, the runs in my stockings, the makeup of my production. Failing at femininity freed me. Can I step into the picture frame? Oh, hazardous joy. Oh, pleasant chaos. There are 4 empty seats where my heart should be. Oh my laughter calming the sirens in my head, a universe splitting the crux of me, the hum of relief touching my body. The trees where my ancestors live are talking to me. Oh, hello, new world. Amber rushing my bones. Oh, my body, reminding me I drove into the sunset that meets the end of the film, that meets sky, my happy ending, a beginning. I affirmed the earth of me, top surgery surging me into the open flame, tearing it down under my feet to the planet of Flatbush, east of nowhere, land of patois, thyme and plantain, hot peppers and jerk chicken. Oh, this naughty joy, a delicacy, ice cream for breakfast every day, conversing with my child self, sitting in the bleachers of my 30s, in a safety vest, cheering me on. You did it, kid. You soared in the final quarter. Have you ever seen a blackbird fly, a piece of galaxy finding its way home? I am thankful to the Black woman who birthed me, who will never understand how the hormones could free me, could be me, could create my own avenue, the final crescendo of my song. Oh, hello, stranger I found in the fire, jumping out the window, who I met in the mirror, who was low. Hello, future me, I took care of you, and here I am, open as a bouquet, a celebration, a graduation, a dream gender, a reggae gay, Jamaican and queer who thought I could be here, a boy in love with every breath of pink. Oh, hello, t-shirt I could not wear, snug against my new chest, man-made and worth every damn day of Medicaid. Why must joy always be born of falling trees, my face hitting asphalt, the gold bleeding from my mouth?
Wow. Andriniki, that was incredible. Thank you so much. That was really, really wonderful.
I have just one more, if that's okay.
Yes, please, please.
This is called The Sun Isn't Out Long Enough. The anthology that I was a part of through M.F.A Press has made this an anthology named after this poem. So I'll get into this. The sun isn't out long enough. The pitch black from outside plays against the clouds in your chest. The wreckage of it all leaves you, and you wake in the morning, dressing for the arrival of a new you who talks like you and looks like you, but happier and charming. You say to yourself, how did we get here? You count all the lines in your palms and every tattoo etched into you. You find a piece of metal welded together that fits the nape of your neck. And you are not a cyborg. It's the year 2020, and pandemically speaking, you have never felt so close to death. It disturbs you enough to wonder if it will be you, or someone you love, or someone you met at a bookstore, or your first friend from college, or your fifth grade teacher, or your neighbor across the street with the Great Dane, or the person you were supposed to meet 3 years ago at a festival, or the passenger next to you on the plane who reminds you of your mother, or your mother. And then you wake up and do your job and do your life. And then it's 7 months, then 10, then vaccine, then the why so many deaths. Then it's fall, then the winter, and the story writes itself now. And the administration will be blamed in the book you haven't read yet, that will be out in 5 years, that you'll hear of in a group chat about divesting from capitalism. And a knot grows in your throat as you realize there is no grid to fall off of, and no country to have you but your own. Thank you.
Woo! Thank you so much, Andriniki. And one more thank you again to Charles and Thyrza, and a special thank you to Times Square Arts, Creative Time, Creative Council, Hauser and Wirth, and the studio for Charles, who have been super supportive in preparing for this NSE. We'd also very much like to thank the Terra Foundation, who sponsors our NSE programs and makes these daily conversations possible. For 22 years, the Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and thoughtful social and political meditations in our monthly publication and in our public events, like here in our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to us to support our writers, editors, and operations here at the Rail. And in Rail form, you can now turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today at this NSE.
Wow.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Really amazing.
Charles.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you.
Hi,
Thank
Christine.
you.
Thank you so much. It was beautiful.
Thank you, Andiki, for the
So
poem. Thank you.
Yeah, those
Yes,
poems
yes,
were
the
wonderful.
poem's beautiful.
They were incredible.
Charlie.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
You all.
Bye.
Bye.
Enjoy the rest of
Bye-bye.
your day.